In this lecture, we'll talk about the biographical information of Anton Chekhov, the Russian playwright, and we'll delve into detail how ultimately he started writing, or he wrote, or composed of, or ultimately emerged as the writer of The Cherry Orchard. Now, Anton Chekhov was born in the year 1860, and he was regarded as one of the figures in the birth of early modernism. He contributed a great deal in the conventions of realism, and he produced around 4 classics, with his best of the stories are held in high regard. They are held in high esteem by the writers and critics, and of course the other important playwrights during this period, among others, say in different other European theatrical practices, were Henrik Ibsen, then August Strindberg. There was G.B. Shaw, who was writing at the same time when Chekhov was writing parallelly in Russia. Then Arthur Miller, Noel Coward, and then apart from him, there had been other major figures as well who have somewhere contributed majorly to the traditions of realism. Now, Chekhov was primarily a medical doctor, and throughout his literary career, he has practiced medicine. At the same time, he contributed short stories for newspapers to earn the money. And he was the one who famously said that medicine is my lawful wife and literature is my mistress. And I'm quoting him, medicine, quote unquote, medicine is my lawful wife and literature is my mistress. When I get tired of one, I go to the other, unquote. The important classics that he gave to the Russian theater tradition and in literature, generally speaking, is The Seagull, that came and that appeared in 1895, then Uncle Vanya, that appeared in 1897, then The Three Sisters, that appeared in 1900, and The Cherry Orchard finally in 1903. Now these all plays were regarded as part of the classical ones. They all in a way recreated and expressed the aspect of realism, of how people truly are and how they speak with one another, and that's how he translated it to the stage so that ultimately the human condition could be projected as accurately as possible. The ends were, he was hoping to make the audience reflect upon their own definition of what it means to be a human. Now, talking about his biographical life, he initially started writing short stories to earn money, and he was also practicing medicine. But later on, with the wealth accumulated because of his writing, literary career, as well as in medicine, he bought a large many number of estates. He bought, in 1892, he bought properties across Russia. He bought estates across Russia, and particularly that can be found in around south of Moscow, Melikovo. And this is where he lived with his family until 1899. And this is also where he, with his own experiences of living with the family, and of course the fact that he had bought up a large estate and was also into farming, into horticulture, into agriculture as well. He was also tending and planting trees, and part of that agricultural routine that exists. So this experiences with living onto the farm helped him construct the details of the characters, and of course of the everyday experiences of this character, how they undergo certain situations giving in a particular society of Russia, the bourgeois society of Russia. And then in the year around 1897, he suffered from tuberculosis. As a result, he developed a major hemorrhage of the lungs, and by the time, I think after 3-4 years, in around 1899, and of course later on 1904, he finally died, and his reputation greatly exceeded after his death, as posthumously many authors are praised, as we have seen in literature and other countries as well. And apart from this, there have been many people who were his aficionados, who were almost like his fans. They all demonstrated that Anton Chekhov deserves all the literary celebrityhood that existed, and he was regarded as an important critical figure only next to Tolstoy in his stature. In fact, Tolstoy himself, writers like Leo Tolstoy and Maxim Gorky, they all used to visit him on his farms. Tolstoy was a great admirer of Chekhov's short stories. He's read The Helpmate, The Boys, The Ladies. These were the ones particularly that he came out in open and appreciated. The Chorus Girl, Children, misery, home, the bed. So these were the stories that he wrote, and through these stories, he brought out the broader situation of Russia of the 1880s that also included talking about poverty, talking about the gloomy political atmosphere, talking about the entire concept of serfdom, and of course the Russian Revolution that was also now then his short stories, talking about his short stories, the kind of characters that he wrote, they were far away from the kinds that we find in classical drama. They were not very strong characters with epic stature, or they were renowned in, or they were known for their bravery, or they were invincible characters who were out there to win battles, to run the kingdoms. Rather, or these same characters who would exhibit a number of heroic traits, heroic values, and of course they would have a different set of ethical and moral system. Rather, his characters were everyday people. His character were very commonplace. His character were banal in nature, and these characters were quite weak. They were fickle-minded. They were at times greedy. They were these spineless characters to whom we might feel repugnant initially, but later on, with the development and evolvement of that same story and character, we start to sympathize and empathize with the same character. In fact, there is a critic who calls him that he is one of those few playwrights who has reveled in stripping the last rags of dignity from the human soul. Chekhov reveled in stripping the last rags of dignity from the human soul, quote unquote. So what we find in Chekhov's story is his characters are not taken from the high and mighty traditions of aristocracy, or those who belong to the particularly elite class, or those who were out there to run the grand kingdoms. Rather, they were commonplace characters. Their problems, their predicament was as normal, as commonplace as it can be expected of in any lower middle class or middle class families. So as a result, what we find in his writing is there is almost no dramatic action. So the play that we are going to take into account is the Cherry Orchard, and as Cherry Orchard in itself reflects that the orchard tree in itself has no direct involvement, or the use of the orchard tree in a way is taken up only to refer to as a being, and its reflection is taken up as an idea to see how around this particular tree centers the characters, their own narrativization, their own idiosyncrasies, and how they behave in a particular situation. How this cherry orchard in a way represent the idea of old order versus the new order, or the conflict of the old order versus the new order. So Chekhov primarily wrote about the mundane life, or the humdrum of these smaller characters, of these normal people on the class spectrum, and these characters would be such whose life would be full of contradictions, whose life would be full of hollowness. They might have been shattering values. There might have been not a very strict system of ethicality, of morality, and they might have been even falling from these ethical systems and moral systems as well. But they do not generally have any element of greatness onto them. And this is where Chekhov had the ability to get into the skin of his character, to get into the skin of almost all sorts of characters, different sorts of characters on the class spectrum. And as a result, he creates incredibly compassionate characters, incredibly sympathetic characters, even for those figures who may not be very appealing in the beginning. So we can derive out from this that Chekhov never believed in creating a clear demarcation of the protagonist versus the antagonist, or the hero or the villain. There doesn't exist any demarcation or clear binaries of hero versus villain in Chekhov's character. As a result, there is a clear fluidity when in terms of depiction of these characters and their idiosyncrasy. So what might happen is initially we might find a particular character to be too cruel or too unsympathetic or too rude, or maybe to an extent a kind of rude initially, and later on by the end of the play we might develop some sort of empathy for the same character. So the idea is he clearly escaped the demarcations of projecting someone as good or bad, or evil, or the ideas, the concepts of good versus evil that we have seen earlier. Now, talking about the Russian stage, but before that, one of the most influential playwrights and short fiction writers, his work is celebrated because of his generous contribution to the Moscow art theater, Russian theater, and modernism. Moscow art theater, Russian theater, as we have in the previous classes, we have discussed about Stanislavski, his role as an outstanding director, how he had directed some of the plays of Mr. Anton Chekhov as well, and how at times these two people would be at loggerheads in terms of the interpretation of Chekhov's own play. So, for example, Chekhov expected a particular play, for example, Cherry Orchard itself, to be projected in a certain manner, say comedy, and Stanislavski essentially brought out the tragic element that underneath that could be found in the play. So this kind of conflict was also quite witnessed, and it was noted by the literary historians. But talking about Moscow art theater and Russian theater particularly, the latter part of 19th century, the Russian stage, as along with the European theatre, they both were almost at the similar pace, and they both were usually can be seen at low ebbs. They did not have any novel elements to be introduced. They did not have any elements of novelty or any new explorations onto the literary scene. And this is at this point of time where this was the time when Chekhov arrived. Now, when Chekhov arrived, he projected, or he tried to project, reality or the element of psychological realism in its entirety, and he primarily believed that reality cannot just be pinned down to simply one way of expressing things. So how we approach the events, how we approach the situations, the subject thematics of say a drama or of any life situation of a human being is entirely different from how an author sees it, and how each individual who is sitting in the audience viewed it. So the human condition is something you have to experience on your own, thinking of your own framework and analyzing within the frameworks or the boundaries of your own analysis. One should make the idea or bring out the idea of what it means to be human. So we were talking about the Russian theatre. So Russian theatre was almost in its infancy. It had nothing novel to offer. It had nothing crucial to offer, and even it was regarded and seen more as very uninspired period in the history of Russian theatre. They were just formulaic themes. There were melodramas that had been continuing from the early 19th century of the modernist tradition. There had been, although there had been light romantic comedies too, but they were burlesque, bedroom farces, and in fact the whole gamut of the whole repertoire of the Russian theatre were majorly the translations from French playwrights, or they were largely based on the French models or even the classical dramas. There had been occasional vaudevilles as well, vaudevilles which includes the elements of song and dance both, and occasionally there would be productions which were based on the Roman plays, the classical Greek plays, or as I mentioned about the French models, the important French playwrights of Jean Racine, Corneille, Molière, and others, and even Shakespeare was performed as well. But with the advent of realism and with the emergence of these few literary playwrights onto the distant parts in Europe, for example, Ibsen and Strindberg emerged, and they started writing. There was a kind of shifting from, Ibsen was regarded as, of course, the father of realism, and Strindberg, we saw he was moving towards looking for symbolic expressionism, but they both were Scandinavians, and they both were writing at the same time in the similar context in different other parts of Europe. And Chekhov also read their translations and admired their works too. But apart from Ibsen and Strindberg, there had been other playwrights as well. For example, G.B. Shaw was writing in Britain. Oscar Wilde was there. Then Zola, he was a novelist in France, and he was particularly emphasizing the symbolist aspect in novels, in prose. Then there had been Richard Hauptmann from Germany. So all these figures, apart from this, there was Maurice Maeterlinck, So these figures were simultaneously writing in different parts of Europe, and these collectively contributed to the concept of realism through their own different varied genres and their own varied writings. So Russian stage more or less very crude in its crude stages, and it was again, as I mentioned, that it was deriving itself out of the classical drama. Even the performances that were there on stage, they were directly referred to the audience, declamatory speeches, uninspired writing, and even the stage design, as it has derived itself from the melodramatic traditions. The stage design were also very flamboyant, so very artificial. So all in all, Russian theatre, until it reached well into the 19th century and until it could truly be called the novel Russian theatre, that could not happen unless we saw the likes of Gogol or Pushkin or Leo Tolstoy or even Anton Chekhov writing, generally speaking, in literature. And these are the ones who not only brought a kind of change onto the dramaturgical stage, they were also associated with bringing up a lot of elements of realism onto the literary landscape as well, literary landscape of Russia. Now, it is also interesting to note that there had been no experimentation in terms of writing down the plays or experimenting with the different forms, primarily because the Russian state, the political affairs in Russia around 1890s and 1900 were such that it did not allow much creativity, much liberty, autonomy to the artist to explore its own forms. And as a result, there had been issues of censorship, there had been issues of when even authors were decidedly authors has been given such judgments of execution. So these are the playwrights that we see who wrote within the safer zones of writing, and they did not really come up directly onto the political commentary scene. And as a result, we see there is no much of an experimentation in terms of the forms of the theatre practices. Then Stanislavski says, and I quote, Chekhov often expresses thought not in speeches, but in pauses or between the lines or in replies consisting of a single word. The characters often feel and think things not expressed in the lines as they speak. Now, it's also important to note that whatever drama that we the dramatic text that we have from Samuel Beckett, or for that matter other playwrights that existed afterward, they had majorly, or Harold Pinter, they had their own inspirations from Anton Chekhov's example. So Anton Chekhov's plays, and especially the elements of the Cherry Orchard, if we discuss, they consisted of elements of realism. It consisted of elements of a kind of shift from realism, elements of anti-realism. There were at certain places there had been certain symbolic representations, indirect references. Then there had been subtle and nuanced understanding of the kind of Russian society through particularly this play, The Cherry Orchard. Then there had been elements of avant-garde practices as well, although Anton Chekhov never arrived onto this so-called avant-garde movement during the period of high modernism, and he was more or less limited to the idea and concept of realism, but the kind of techniques he was adopting, the kind of audacity he was doing in terms of the technicality of writing plays or the drama performances, they were somewhere hinting towards the inclusion of more and more complexity and nuances in his plays, rather than just a surface level understanding of particular drama. So what we witness is more like a subterranean level understanding of what he wrote as a common drawing room comedies, or not comedies, but drawing room realistic dramas. So his ideation, in other words, he was also known as the master of subtext, because he was taking up the issues and talking of human experiences of particular families or of particular in a particular time period, but his focus usually had been discussing the nuances of it and not just talking on the surface. The subterranean level connections, the subterranean level ideations that existed, and to bring them to the fore in order to raise certain, not just controversy, but to bring to the surface the conflicts that exist in human dealings in everyday life. That is something that was his forte. So his ideation rested on the premise that the role of an artist was to ask questions, not to answer them. So when we think of taking up any of the play by Anton Chekhov, be it The Seagull, The Three Sisters of or Uncle Vanya, or the fact that we are currently reading The Cherry Orchard, we have to keep up certain things in mind. We cannot look for realism, straightaway realism in these plays. And if I focus on The Cherry Orchard, we should avoid a clear, straightforward, direct reading of the play. Then we can expect certain conventional endings or happy endings, because there were none. And this is one of the reasons why Virginia Woolf commented, and as you can see on your screens, and I quote, but is it the end, we ask? We have rather the feeling that we have overrun our signals, or it is as if a tune had stopped short without the expected chords to close it. These stories are inconclusive, important word. These stories are inconclusive, we say, and proceed to frame a criticism based on the assumption that stories ought to conclude in a way that we recognize. In doing so, we raise the question of our own fitness as a reader, quite important. Even question our own fitness, our own ability, or our own credibility to regard ourselves as readers. Where the tune is familiar and the end emphatic, lovers unite, Williams discomfited, intrigues exposed. We can scarcely go wrong. But where the tune is unfamiliar and the end of a note of interrogation, or merely the information that we went on talking, as it is in Chekhov, we need a very daring and alert sense of literature to make us hear and tune in. Those last notes which complete the harmony. So the idea is, in Beckett, whatever Beckett's understanding of, say, for example, Waiting for Godot, whatever technical innovations that we have witnessed in Samuel Beckett's plays, for example, as a reference point we're taking Waiting for Godot, these were not something that originated within himself. Beckett was majorly inspired from Anton Chekhov himself. And this is where the beauty of Chekhov's writing existed, the beauty of Chekhov's depiction of characterization existed. He never portrayed any single villain or any single angel, for that matter. There was no clear demarcation of the protagonist versus the antagonist. And as a result of this, he never blamed on people about the consequences of certain situations. He never exculpated anyone. He never raised someone to any particular stature, nor he brought down underneath. Rather, true to his own words, his plays did not have any angels and villains, and that was something can be regarded as a clear mark, as a drastic break with almost the entire history of drama, and or for that matter, fiction too. If we go through the beginnings of literature, that is, I'm talking of literature beginning from, that could encompass from the Greeks' writings, the Roman playwrights composing their own literature, or for that matter, in England too. We see the classical drama, epic poetry, even romantic poetry, romantic literature, or not romantic novels, even the novel as a genre itself. The literary imagination had largely been propelled by pitting the good against the evil, the darkness against the light, a kind of Manichaean division which clearly stated these categories into heroes and villains, both of pulp fiction and its various derivatives and popular plays. So the idea is that this kind of division that we see usually, this kind of tension, this kind of struggle that we see usually, this kind of idea of good guy versus bad boy, or the forces of light versus the negativity of darkness. This is something, this is not clearly demarcated, this is not clearly depicted in Anton Chekhov's writing. And Probably this contributes to one of the high points of realism, this element that Chekhov introduced by making the boundaries of protagonist versus antagonist more fluid. He introduced this element of high complexity in realism, and as a result, we saw that ultimately anti-realism or the movement for anti-realism emerged, or avant-garde movement or practices in theater or in drama emerged. All these ideations of stream of consciousness, of silences, pauses, inability to inarticulate, all these elements that exist in drama, we witnessed that all thanks to the introduction of complexity by Mr. Chekhov, by Mr. Strindberg, by Mr. G.B. Shaw, by Mr. Noel Coward or Arthur Miller. These literary dramatic figures, they contributed majorly in introducing or expanding the contours of realism. In the next lecture, we'll delve into the details of the cherry orchard. And of course, we'll start with the text. Thank you very much.